So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of the water that I need and go ahead and get it on the stove. Now I didn't get as much water as I wanted into that pot, but what I can do is, as the broth comes to a simmer or comes to a boil and I turn it down to a light simmer, I'm going to go ahead and add more water. That point you can go ahead and add hot water to it. It makes a big difference in the beginning, but once you have the broth simmering, then you can go ahead and add hot water to replenish as it's cooking. I want to go ahead and cook this for a certain period of time. If you're making a stock, the stock, if it was chicken, would end up cooking for about 3 or 4 hours. And at least that's textbook. Whenever you're making a broth, you don't want to overcook those meats that are in there. So you have two choices. You can either add everything together, the aromatics, the vegetables, and the chicken with the water, and add it in there and cook it until the chicken's done. Or I could have went ahead and put the chicken in first, simmered that until the chicken meat was done, pulled it out, pulled the chicken meat off, put the bones back in, and then cooked it for a specific amount of time. In the last hour or so of cooking, throw the vegetables in, the last half an hour throw the aromatics in. It's a stage progression of cooking that you would do normally for a stock. When it comes to a broth, people have different ways of doing it. Like if I was cooking a piece of beef, the beef is going to take a lot longer to cook, to break down, to tenderize, where I can use it in a soup possibly. I might go ahead and wait for a little bit longer whenever I was doing that versus the chicken. The beef will take a couple hours versus just about an hour to cook. So that's the big difference. So at this point, I'm standing by the stove waiting for the broth to come up to a simmer. Once it comes to a simmer, though, it's a matter of turning it down, light bubbles, nothing really hard. Remember, again, it's going to push on those vegetables and turn them to mush if I cook it too hard, and it's going to cloud my broth. So I'm just going to go ahead and let it go, and probably about an hour I'm going to come back to it and pull the chicken meat out and strain the rest of the broth. So as I said, you now have it up to a boil. I'm going to turn it down to a simmer, very light bubble. And you notice what happens on the top here is that you get all of this scum that builds up. And what that is it's all the impurities, all the protein that's coagulating. It's coming to the top. And what you need to do, and I said this was pretty much maintenance free, but if you want a clearer stock, you want to come in and try to get rid of those cloudy, bubbly things on the top there. You're also going to see a little bit of chicken fat that is liquefied come to the top. And if you can take that off, that's only going to help to improve the clarity of your broth. And this would apply to a stock too. If I had bones and I was just making the stock, it's pretty much the same thing. And I got that big piece of chicken in there that's in the way, but I can move these around a little bit, push them to one side, and the impurities and the fat will pool to one area, so I can just take the edge of a ladle and take that off. If I take a little bit of that broth, it's not going to be the end of the world. And remember, I'm adding more hot water as this is simmering if I have too much reduction or if I lose too much in the process. You don't need to get it all off, just try to get most of it, and like I said, pull your vegetables to one side so you have an area that you can work with as it's slightly simmering. So I'm going to let it go for another 45-50 minutes and then go ahead and pull my chicken out. In the process, maybe 2 or 3 times I'll come over and just take the scum off the top and that additional fat. Okay, so we've simmered the broth for about an hour, skimmed the scum a couple times during the process, taking the extra fat off. And like I said before, you have an option of just pulling the meat out, taking the meat off, putting the bone back in, and cooking a little bit longer if you feel like you want to get a little bit more flavor out of the bone. I think we've got pretty good extraction off of an hour, so I'm going to go ahead, and you can actually tell when you've got the meat cooked enough just by pulling on it or tugging on it a little bit and seeing that it pulls apart. Now here again, the only two things that we want out of this are the meat in the end that we're going to use in the final product, and the liquid, which has now become the broth. It has a nice smell of vegetable chicken, of course. Actually, the chicken's pretty much, you can smell that from about 100 yards away now. It's kind of gone the whole way through the area here. The other thing that you can smell is the aromatics, the thyme. It hadn't cooked that long that the thyme flavor, the bay leaf flavor, and the smells have dissipated. If you were to make a stock and cook it for 3 to 4 hours and put that mirepoix and put those aromatics in the beginning, you'd probably lose most of that, but I can still really smell that really well. What I'm going to do is now I'm going to go ahead and strain it. Let me bring this over so you can see it. Normally I'd strain it with a chamois, which is a very fine mesh strainer. Depending on what I was going to use it on, if I needed it really crystal clear, I might consider using a chamois with some cheesecloth. There's another application where you actually make a consommé by clarifying it. We're not going to do that today, but we will use the cheesecloth. If I just needed it to use into something else that I was eventually going to strain it again, what's called a china cap or a coarse sieve would do just fine. But for this demo, I just want to show you how nice of a color you end up having. And I won't do it all, I'll just do enough here. You get that little bit of a yellow hue, which comes mostly from the fat. And of course it's nice and clear from gentle simmering. Of course I'll go ahead and strain the rest of that a little bit later. But you can see from this that it has that nice yellow hue. Like I said, it's pretty clear. It has a little bit of fat still on top, and what I can do is a couple different things to get that off. I can either take the ladle again and swirl on the inside and try to get that off, tilt it down and try to remove that way. This measuring device has one of those spouts on the side that the fat stays on top, and you can go ahead and pour, so your fat will be on the top here the whole way going down, and you can get the fat-free broth out because it's coming out the bottom. That's another way. You could also go ahead and chill this down and refrigerate it, and that fat it won't be rock hard for chicken broth. If you were doing beef, it probably would be. You could just chisel that right off the top. With chicken fat, it doesn't get really hard, so you can go ahead most of the time and just, it's a lot easier. It's a lot thicker than the broth, so you can take it off that way. I've also taken strips of paper towel and went ahead and put it across the top of the broth to try to get that excess fat off too. But here you have it, a nice, well seasoned, as far as the aromatics, as far as the vegetables, as far as the chicken broth. It doesn't have a lot of salt, it doesn't have a lot of peppery flavor. That'll come later if you want it in the final preparation.